Good evening, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy days to join us for this webinar. My name is Siwan Howerton and I'm a dairy scientist at AHDB Dairy. I'm delighted to bring you tonight's webinar on multi-species swards for dairy systems. Our presenter today is Ralph Logs from Germany. Tonight's webinar is being delivered as part of the Eurodairy Network. This network includes 14 countries from Ireland to Poland and Sweden to Italy. It aims to put farmers at the centre of practice-based innovation by sharing knowledge and solution. You can find more out about Eurodairy by visiting www.eurodairy.eu. Tonight's webinar has proved very popular with just over 130 registrations from dairy farmers, vets, nutritionists, consultants, researchers from 13 countries right across Europe and the world. The plan for this webinar is for Ralph to run through his presentation, which will take around 30 minutes, and then there will be time for comments and questions at the end. You will all stay muted throughout the webinar, but if anyone would like to ask a question, then please type your question into the box on the left-hand side of your screens. I will then ask Ralph your questions at the end of his presentation. We will aim to finish up within an hour. I would like to thank our digital manager, Elena, who is working behind the scenes and will endeavour to keep this webinar running as smooth as possible. But please bear with us if we do encounter any technical difficulties. We will try to keep these to a minimum. I am delighted to introduce our speaker for tonight. Ralph is a senior scientist at the Faculty of Agriculture and Nutritional Sciences of Kiel University. He works in the Grass and Forage Science and Organic Agriculture Department of the university. Ralph has over 20 years of research experience in the field of forage production and organic agriculture. His research interests include low-cost grazing production systems, greenhouse gas emissions, and the nitrogen cycle, especially in the estimation of symbiotic nitrogen fixations by legumes. Ralph also focuses on the evaluation of organic cropping systems in respect to yield, product quality, sustainability, economic and environmental effects. Prior to his career, Ralph completed vocational agriculture training and gained 2 years of practical farming experience on both Danish and English dairy farms. So without further delay, it's over to you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. Good evening for giving me the opportunity to tell you a little bit about our work on secondary legumes and herbs in my presentation with the title Potential of Secondary Legumes in Multi-Species Mixtures in Forage Production in Northwest Europe. Just that you see who's talking to you and where I'm located. There's the map of Germany, and it's in the very north, just below the border to Denmark, where Kiel, the capital of Holstein, is located, and most of our experiments are from our research farm Lindhof. And this webinar is part of Working Group 3, resource efficiency of the Eurodairy network, but of course it also touches the working group of biodiversity. First, I would like to tell you a bit why we got interested in herbs and other legumes, or even then the multi-species swards, what a lot of people are talking about. As I showed you on the map, we are in the north of Germany, an area where there is very favorable growing conditions for grass and white clover. Herbs are not so typical as in the more temperate, in the more dry regions or the hillock regions of Germany. So when we want to make use of them, we have to introduce them in our seed mixtures. So the interests in herbs and legumes are, of course, in modern times, increasing biodiversity. We have the feeling that pure grass swards and pure mice swards take over, and there is a lack of flowering plants in our environment, and insects and close related to insects, also bird life, suffer under a too low biodiversity. We have seen reported positive impacts on animal performance when using herbal forage plants, maybe also due to secondary plant components. And also from old studies, when it comes to the taste, a lot of herbs have a good taste and give a high forage uptake. I will show you a little bit from a study from the University of Kassel in a few seconds. I would like to tell you that there's a high potential of high contents of minerals and vitamins in both legumes and herbal forage plants. And a lot of studies are known and shown that show positive impacts on product quality, both meat quality, but for example, also the fatty acid composition of milk. There are studies showing also phytotherapeutic values. I will come to this and explain you and show to you the antihelminthic effects, and that we can use some plants, for example, for prevention of bloat, which was also one of our interests in very intensive grazing systems. This is very closely related to both topics I just named before, very close related to the content of tannins as secondary plant components. And some of those, especially, for example, also when talking about red clover or dandelion, they have high contents of the so-called polyphenol oxidases, which may have a positive impact on protein utilization. A lot of species we have to talk about, or I want to talk about today, have deep roots, and they can help us to increase water use efficiency. And of course, when it comes to nearly lost, leached out plant nutrients in the deeper soil layers, deep rooting species may help us getting them back into the nutrient circle. And of course, these deep rooting species may contribute positively to the soil fertility. That was already the founders of the organic movements that talked about this. Chosen secondary legumes as alternative to the white clover under the Northwest European conditions. Of course, we have the white clover, which has a very, very high potential for grazing. Due to a low fiber content, we have high energy contents, but the low fiber content and the very, very light degradable proteins may also lead to the bloat problems. As direct alternatives often used for cutting systems, we have the alfalfa, or called also lucerne, which is compared to the white clover, a very, very deep-rooted legume. And on top of this, it adds us very high quality fiber. And but the problem is it does not suit very well to high cutting intensities. Often when it comes to 5 defoliations, it disappears. Then I named it before, the red clover, also deep-rooted, we have these high contents of PPO, polyphenol oxidases, that present us a very, very stable protein, which often is underestimated. And now we are really coming to the so-called secondary legumes. Often we hear about sainfoin, espacette, which has very, very high contents of tannins. This guarantees us very stable protein, and I show you in a second some anthelmintic effects. We very often use the birdsfoot trefoil, Lotus corniculatus, which also contains a lot of tannins, which gives us stable protein, but we also use it as a strategy to prevent bloat. Then there are other legumes often used in seed mixtures, which may have their advantages. Sometimes used is the hybrid clover. We use it because it is very good performing on heavy, wet and clayey soils, of course, when talking on lay farming. And often in seed mixtures containing legumes and herbs, we find the black medic, where one of the advantages is easy seed production. It can be perennial, but we'll have to see how it is performing. We so far don't use it. Then in some seed mixtures, we find the sweet clover, Melliot. It tolerates very, very low soil fertility and maybe they're an option, but it contains also coumarin, which may be a little bit dangerous for ruminants, so we won't use this. Then there are two other possibilities, the Serradella, which we only would say is an opportunity when it comes to very, very low pH values, but its disadvantage is it's just annual, and therefore even in the border, at the border, if it's useful for lay farming. And we often use crimson clover, not because of its good forage quality, but it is a joker for very late sowing because it develops very, very fast in early spring, but disappears after the first cut in spring, and then gives place for white clover and red clover. That's more or less the candidate plants I would tell you about in the next seconds or minutes. And I come to the herbal forage plants a little bit later. Just this with protein quality, protein stability. We know alfalfa and white clover, they have high protein contents, but they are very, very fast degrading, both in trials, but also in the rumen. And that gives no stable, low contents of undegradable dietary protein. So therefore, it might be not so interesting for high yielding cows. But then when it already comes to the red clover, where I told you there is a plant component called polyphenol oxidase, it comes to the point that it slows degradation down, and it first happens in the intestines, and we have very high stable protein UDP contents, which are as quite interesting when we, for example, compare it to soybean meal. So this might be a real alternative also when feeding gene modified free, then red clover might be an alternative. When it comes to the tannin containing plants, we have the birdsfoot trefoil. 7% of tannins could be possible. This this also gives stable protein, and it's the complex binding of protein which releases in the intestines, which gives very good protein quality. And then there is the sainfoin with more or less very, very high tannin equivalence, which really slows the UDP concentration, maybe too much that we even excrete it with the feces. But the sainfoin can something special, but always and often reported when it comes to the use of, for example, birdsfoot trefoil. We have these condensed tannins effects, that we have higher daily lamp weight gains, or for example also higher milk yields. And when also looking to sainfoin, we can have higher yields, but it's always difficult to tell what are the main effects. Is it the contains of tannins, or is it when comparing it just to pasture that we of course have high protein contents? But talking about sainfoin, we often report anthelmintic effects, and here we see a nematode worm which is in the intestines when not treated with sainfoin extracts. And here we see a comparable animal in the low pictures where there was sainfoin added. This one can't hold in the intestines, and we really can see that we have anthelmintic effects. So that might be very interesting, and it's even shown in experiments where two varieties of sainfoin A and B were tested with one washing in the middle, where it releases the nematodes, and compared to the treatment and the control, we show that's a good opportunity to help the animals on the field. But to continue my presentation, presenting also herbs that are often added to lay seed mixtures in Germany, but also in our neighbor country, Denmark, organic creameries want their farmers to add biodiversity to their grass-clover fields by saying they should add also herbal forage plants. And therefore, we often find the sheep burnet, Sangiozorba minor, which is very high, have very high contents of secondary plant components, which also guarantee stable protein. We often see the chicory added, which also have high contents of secondary plant components. It's very deep rooted. Some people tell also anti-helminthic effects. We always find in the fields that deers invading our fields always take the blossoms when they can find them. A very interesting herb is, of course, the dandelion, which has reported a lot of positive effects on milk yields, but due to its poor yield performance, one might not want to have it more than 10%. So therefore, it's maybe not the typical thing we should add in our seed mixtures, but you will see about forage quality. Then often added, we have caraway, which is rich in ethereal oils and has positive effects on digestion and works antibacterial. And now often we are hearing from New Zealand works presented there that they produce pure stands of Lancelot plantain, which also is a deep rooting herb, which is rich also in contents of secondary plant components, and it works anti-inflammatory. And often added also is yarrow, which is also rich in sorry, I have the difficulties in spelling it, but you can read it, ethereal oils with positive effects in digestion. It works antibacterial and anti-inflammatory. In some mixtures, we also find meadow sage, chervil, and parsley. We worked on this, but sorry, unfortunately, due to poor emergence after seeding, I can't tell from my point of view positive stories about these last three ones that maybe we can talk about in the discussions. But on the other ones, I can give you some results, how they performed. And which species would a cow choose? There had been at our neighbor university, the University of Kassel, real trials where one established plots of pure stands and had a look what cows would prefer when they get the opportunity. And maybe a nice picture, but of course there is a table. And here in the next table, you can really see that animals, they like the birdsfoot trefoil in limited time. The cows went very, very often to the plots of the birdsfoot trefoil. They really loved the plantain and the chicory and the sheep burnet, which is proved by the antler of bites per time. And then when it comes to yarrow, it's only in half of the bites, or very, very little compared to the birdsfoot trefoil. So the preferred species that are those we also prefer in our seed mixtures and which often are used in other seed mixtures. And when it comes to different other species, the cows maybe won't like it, like for example the tarragon or the meadow sage. But I told Simon before I also would talk about marshmallow. Not that you have to feed them processed as sweets, but of course there is a herb called marshmallow, which also once was used producing the sweets, but here in this original way, the cows won't like it. But to some trials we did at our Lindhof, we're working since 2005 with the potential of herbs and secondary plant components on fields very close to the Baltic Sea. We work both in pure stands, but in the end I will explain you also on grazing conditions. Here you can see a pure stand, for example, of chicory, and here of birdsfoot trefoil, and here some English farmers visiting our trials. This was nearly 5 years ago. But to the results, sorry, I didn't tell you, we have a very nice climate for growing of grass and clover, very even spread rainfall of around 800 millimeters, where even traditionally June, July, and August are the months with the highest rainfall, but there we also have the highest evapotranspiration. An average temperature with mild winters 8.7 degrees, and all the following results are from soils on sandy, loamy soils. Dry matter yields, of course, when no additional N fertilizer is added, we see a very big advantage of different legume species. And when we have it in a 3-cut system, 3 times cut for silage, and then one after grazing, where of course alfalfa and red clover did the best performance. White clover is not made in pure stands for these systems, and all other legumes, they can't catch up. And the sainfoin, where we had a lot of hope to grow it here, it never really turned out because it really wants the soils with very high pH values. So this was just a dream, but it didn't turn out. Of course, when looking to grass yields, this is not the yield of a high fertilized grass, but the yields of a starving grass. But to show what chicory, for example, with its deep root is doing when nitrogen is limited, and when it comes to getting nutrients from deeper soil layers, chicory and even the plantain can catch up with the perennial ryegrass. But of course, this is a low input situation for pure stands. But now to some forage quality measures where we more or less can see the strong point why we are using a lot of perennial ryegrass. Here, the herbs like the sheep's burnet and dandelion and caraway and yarrow, they can present the same high energy levels than grass, but our legumes, they have their strong sides in the protein contents. So alfalfa is not made for high energy yields, and even the white clover has its difficulties when only cut 3 times. But I come back to this later. But why growing legumes is, of course, they reach protein contents which no other forage plant can reach. Here it's no real difference between all the tested varieties, species, but the sainfoin, it really had its difficulties at our place, maybe due to the fact too low pH values. Even if it was a pH value of 6, the rhizobia bacteria had its difficulties, but no strong protein contents in the herbs and in the grass fraction. But now, when it comes to the point where there is a strong point for legumes and herbal forage plants, this is when having a look at the mineral contents, the very expensive calcium, for example. All herbs and all legumes have at least twice as high calcium contents, even 3 times higher calcium contents than perennial ryegrass. And here it's especially the chicory and the plantain we should name, but all legumes as well, which is very interesting when it comes to the economic values, where Danish farmers tell us that they really save money, also with the point that they save money for mineral additives. Just one more factor, parameter, the phosphorus content. Here, of course, grass has higher values, but it can't catch up to that what herbs can offer us here. Here also a strong point for the herbs. It's very difficult. I showed you some points with respect to tannins and protein quality of some chosen species. In all our trials, we also had a look on chosen secondary plant metabolites. It's a picture from one article we did for the EGF meeting in 2014, I think in Norway it was. Here I have a different list of abbreviations. It's written here, but especially the Sainfoin OV and the Lotus corniculatus LC show these high contents of secondary plant components, and the salad burnet Sangiovese minor has very, very high contents, and also the yarrow. So there is good proof that there are interesting components in it. But to more or less round it up in 5 minutes now, we, of course, it will be very difficult if we think of growing them in pure swards. Reality is, of course, mixed swards, and that's also how we grow them on our experimental farm. So we'll tell you a little bit about yield potential of multi-species swards compared to the standard grass clover, and as influenced by harvest frequency. That's how these stands look like here in picture number 2. I want to show you some results from a 4-year series we did from 2014 to 2017 under these favorable growing conditions on sandy loamy soils, where we had 3 different harvest frequencies or defoliation frequencies. So far, no real grazing. This comes in the last point. We did multi-species swards, which we compared to grass clover, traditional grass clover in this area. I come to the seed mixtures in a second. We defoliated every 3rd week. That was treatment 1, 3V, and every 4th week, and of course in a system where we cut 4 times per year. We compared in this study a mixture of perennial ryegrass, red clover, which is quite common in organic farming in Germany, and white clover. We compared it to a mixture where we added herbs and reduced the seed rates of perennial ryegrass and red clover and white clover with 1/3, and added birdsfoot trefoil, caraway, salad burnet, chicory, and lanceolate plantain, and observed it over 4 years. But I made an average of the dry matter yield in tons over the last 4 growing seasons, growing years here, when defoliated every 3rd week, when defoliated every 4th week, and when grown in a forked system. Of course, in a forked system, we have the highest yield because we don't have the recovery phases with suboptimal leaf area index, and with the decreasing, with increasing defoliation intensity, we have a decrease in yields. But you can see our seed mixture containing herbs never yielded less. On average, it yielded more than the traditional seed mixture containing perennial ryegrass, red clover, and white clover. And a very interesting thing might be that even the red clover tolerated this high cutting frequency in our traditional 2 years lay system. But when looking to the growth rates in the very intensive phases, we can see here in gray where we have higher growth rates when we compare the different months in the later phase of the growing season, when the grass typically has a lower production. So most higher yields come from the months when it was warmer and when it was drier. But when breaking it down to the different yields, it was that the gray colored curves show, especially in the years 2014, 15, and 16, superior yields when also having the deep-rooted herbs and birdsfoot trefoil in it, especially in 2016, where we had a real dry and warm spring, where we got superior yields. But some of you might have seen it. 2017 was completely different. It was very wet, and there we could not show. We even had lower yields when adding the deep-rooted species. Just to show you a bit why we had only in a few in drier yields this yields the high yield potential. But now, just 2 more last slides. When it comes to yield and quality potential of multi-species when grazed, we actually also grazed these swards very often. But here we were working with 3 different seed mixtures I want to introduce you. Grass and white clover, of course, when talking about the dry matter yields, just containing grass and white clover. Then we added red clover to the seed mixture, and where we added also again herbs and birdsfoot trefoil. The red clover, when we looked at the dry matter yields on offer before grazing, it had the highest yield potential. But when it comes to grazing residuals, they didn't like the red clover too much. So also the leftovers were a little bit higher. But the cows loved to graze the grass clover with the herbs, and therefore also under the grazing condition, when it comes to the uptake in 9 times grazing, the grass clover with herbs was a very, very good alternative, especially to the grass and white clover. And it also was superior when, with respect to the yields, when it was cut 4 times. One thing behind is, of course, that cows graze selective, and when it comes to the energy concentration in megajoules for netto energy lactation, where 6.4 usually is a very, very good grass silage, the cows select and take better quality when grazing, and have their leftovers in the seed mixtures. So grazing, of course, gives better energy concentrations compared to that what there was on offer. To sum up a bit, or to draw a facet, according to our experience, secondary legumes and herbs are a good possibility to increase biodiversity. Of course, I showed you now synthetic biodiversity. So we came with the flowering plants on our own, with a seed mixture, but a lot of insect life was present. The beekeeper at our farm is very, very impressed. He can't get his arms down because of very, very high honey yields. So this is one step towards a land of milk and honey. And we could reduce mineral supplementation. We got very good forage uptake, and no reduction of yields were observed when making these multi-species swards. And I could show you that the deep-rooting species like red clover, chicory, plantain, and birdsfoot trefoil increased water use efficiency in dry yields. In our intensive grazing system, we haven't seen bloat at Lindhof. This might also be due to red clover, birdsfoot trefoil, and herbs in the seed mixture. And we prefer to add to our white clover grass, red clover, chicory, plantain, and birdsfoot trefoils. As I told you, sometimes we add the crimson clover when you have to establish on autumn and when it's not the optimal time for it. We even use the hybrid clover, where I didn't talk too much, but this is just to repair our swards and spots where we have heavy clay spots where all other legumes don't emerge. Then we do some hand seeding on a Sunday afternoon, just broad spreading some seeds of hybrid clover. And when we are working with very intensive fertilized swards, there still is a possibility to make use of some benefits of herbs when we then say we just establish some pure zone stripes of our herbs we want to introduce, instead of mixing them with very expensive seeds into the complete field seed mixtures. So some pure zone stripes might also be an option for very intensive farmers. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention. That's it.
Thanks a million, Ralph. That was a very interesting presentation and great to learn about what results you've seen at Lindhof. While I'm waiting for some questions to come up, I would just like to remind you that tonight's presentation has been recorded and will be available to watch back on the Eurodairy website, along with other webinars from the last 2 years. So the questions are coming in thick and fast, Ralph. So the first question is from William, and he would like you just to clarify what was the pH of the soil.
We use the pH, or we try to have the pH of 6 on our fields. 6.2 higher gives no meaning, but with this pH value, we had difficulties with the sainfoin, even if we got some top dressing of lime before seeding it. We didn't succeed. We had no success with the sainfoin.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Ina. What are the benefits of growing mixtures as opposed to monocultures?
Of course, it gives some stabilities of the yields. So I was in the second part of my presentation presenting the situation of an organic or a very low input system where we want to have the legumes also to come in with the nitrogen. And the legumes, they feed the sward, and we even have this as a part of a crop rotation where we, after 2 years of grass-clover, want to use the nitrogen for the following crops for arable crops. So we are in a situation where the soils are depleted for nitrogen, and therefore we need the mixed swards. Of course, we need the next mixed swards so that the cows get a balanced ration, and of course, in some years, some of our species didn't emerge properly, and we got some weed problems, and therefore we only choose the strongest species like the plantain, the birdsfoot trefoil, which had its advantage that is also fixing nitrogen, and the chicory into our swards. And so far you could see it worked out, but we just know most herbs, they also like the nitrogen, and you can push them by adding nitrogen, but then we rather would use our slurry in our arable fields.
Great, thanks, Ralph. And the next question is from David, and David's question is, what about other grasses such as cockfoot and meadow fescue? We rely on these as we are in a dry area.
Mm-hmm. I see good advantages of them. I haven't prepared this for this presentation. Cocksfoot, we are not so much favoring because it's not too good working in our intensive system here. Of course, it is dry resistant, and therefore it might be a good alternative. I don't know the right word, I think, in English, but it is growing in bushes. It's not so evenly spread. So sometimes in very dense swards, but this is of course under humidic condition, it smells not too good. So we use Festuca arundinacea and there are good varieties, new varieties, and even now I really missed the proper scientific name, the Festulolium, where one species of Festuca is bred with ryegrass species as being a good alternative. And the Arundinacea, Festuca arundinacea, and the Festulolium, it really helped us under drier conditions. So if there's still time, I might be do a webinar on different grass species.
Another evening, maybe, Ralph.
Yeah.
The next question is from Lupo. In the perennial ryegrass mix, what was the relative red and white clover content of the seed mix?
We established it traditionally as understory at the end of a crop rotation. So it's sown in the late April in a winter cereal. And so what we do is in this seed mixture, we take 4 different species of perennial ryegrass. We take one diploid to give the sward density. Here we often use 6 to 8 kilograms of perennial ryegrass, and then we take a high energy perennial ryegrass, which is tetraploid, which is adding then also with 6 and 8 kilograms. Then we take one, and in the beginning, 10 years ago, we also took 2 kilograms of white clover. But in these grazing systems, we have it natural now. And then we add 3 kilograms of red clover. And when it comes to the point of the multi-species, we reduce these seed mixtures are named by 1/3, but then add 2 kilograms of chicory, 4 kilograms of birdsfoot trefoil, 2 kilograms per hectare of caraway, and 1 kilogram of plantain, which has very, very tiny seeds. There maybe also half a kilo could do.
Great, thank you. We'll quickly move on to Felicity's question. In the 4-cut system, how did the herbage silage quality turn out? And do you have any top tips in managing when ensiling the herbage?
We had our difficulties. We were always to tell you our story is we was when the milk quota was disappearing, we swapped from suckler cows to a very intensive grazing dairy herd. When feeding suckler cows, we didn't have our problems with this 3 cuts silage and 1 after grazing or 4-cut silage, but we never reached the forage qualities we really wanted in our intensive grazing system. So we really would like to have a 5-cut silage system, but the problem is then we don't have the amounts. But doing it in rotational grazing, we really take 3 or 4-week-old cuts and ensile them, and we really take bale silage. We had our difficulties with clamp silage. We never had the optimal drying conditions, especially also with the red clover. Of course, we use a conditioner for breaking the stems, but we are really fans now of baled silage cut at a very young stage. We try to use the best days of the week for having very quick wilting. But in our seasonal calving herd, of course, we just have one ration, and therefore the baled silage is a good opportunity.
Great. Next question is from Chris. Birdsfoot always gives good performance figures as a pure stand, but seems a nightmare to establish in a mix. Should we even bother if it's only going to achieve 1 or 2% in a mix?
It depends, of course, on the price. I made one experience the last two years. We had very good performances 2010, 2011. But of course, we had to add the rhizobium bacteria to it. And then we had some years where it didn't work out. And then I think I found out that the rhizobia preparations were not good enough. And now for the last 2 years, I got another supplier, and then the birdsfoot trefoil turns out better. But of course, when the red clover is strong, the birdsfoot trefoil might suffer under it. So, but the red clover is has very stable protein. So maybe when it's not there, the birdsfoot trefoil has its possibilities. But here I would say maybe like in this picture you see now with the plantain. Maybe offering some stripes where it's just the birdsfoot trefoil, and then let the cows go there and take it. But of course, in ensiling, you may as well make stripes so that in each forage wagon or each bale, you have some parts of the stripe.
There's quite a few questions left, Ralph, so we'll just try and go quickly through a few of these.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. What, in your opinion, is the optimal time for seeding the herbal lays?
So we had our difficulties with autumn establishment because they really don't show their tap roots. They took too much energy in spring to establish their roots, and we really lost time. So we went over to the understory, and of course at the end of the crop rotation there was not too dense cereal swards. So for us it was optimal understory in April or early May, and then just get rid of the stubble, and then we even get 2 times grazing afterwards.
Great. There's quite a few questions coming in on grazing guidelines for multi-species lays. Should we do the same as for grazing grassland, or what would your recommendations be, Ralph?
Yes, the problem is of course we are not too experienced in older lays. I visited also in the Eurodairy project an organic farmer close to Birmingham. He is using this in a very intensive grazing system over 5 years, and in year number 5 he renews the sward, and after 5 years he still had these herbal plants, but he was on a very dry soil, where on a poor soil, where also these herbs have a good opportunity, and he's grazing very intensively. We are grazing intensively, but forage quality of chicory is miserable when it's not grazed intensively, and it might be just the plantain that is left over. And when this comes to flowering, also the energy contents is very low, so we need the intensive grazing.
Great, thank you. And try and get a few more questions in, if that's okay, Ralph. Andrew would like to know, how would you cope with weed pressure at establishment?
For us, this is solved by the understory. Of course, when sowing, when we are in a crop rotation, we have most annual weeds disappearing after the first cut, but this first cut, when dominated by weeds, is also of miserable quality. So we really prefer establishment in a cereal when weed control had been done. So we go straight over to a very fine to swards where there are not too many weeds in it.
Great, thank you. Rachel has sent in a question. When grazing and there is a residual left, should the sward be then mown and allowed to regrow again before the next grazing?
Yes, we did do it. We do this stopping definitely, because otherwise the chicory and the plantain, they're getting too old, and the cows will don't take it. As I said, the decks will take the flowers, but that's all of it. No, we cut it, or we even introduce 2 silage cuts in between grazing, and then getting rid of these old material.
Thank you. Well, unfortunately, this will have to be our last question before we run out of time. And Will's question is, do you think alfalfa warrants a place in a high-yielding dairy cow ration when alongside maize and perennial ryegrass?
Yes, we need it added as hay. Then its fiber quality is fantastic, but then you have to grow it in pure stands. But there are some grazing types on its way, but I've seen it has difficulties in establishment. So we'll have to see what the seed companies come up with.
Great, thank you very much, Ralph. I am aware that we haven't been able to answer everyone's questions, but we will email these through to Ralph and we'll get back to you as soon as possible, if that's okay. So a big thank you to all of you for listening. We've had a great turnout and participation in this webinar. Please do keep an eye out on the EuroDairy website, which is eurodairy.eu, for future webinars and for the recordings of previous webinars. So a very special thank you to Ralph for taking the time out of his busy day. And the recording of this webinar will be available to watch back in due course, and you will all receive an email when the link is live on the website. So thank you all very much, and good night.
Thank you all.